And Catherine Loubier is with us. Welcome. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's nice being here.
As Quebec's new Delegate General in New York, it's a quasi-diplomatic position, but it primarily is your focus on trade and trade relations between Quebec and the States.
Yes. The mandate is mostly trade, you're right when you say that, because this is what Premier Legault really wants to focus on. Increasing exports to the world and increasing investments in Quebec.
And you talk about exports. New York State is Quebec's number one.
It is number one.
Partner,
it is number one with $8.1 billion in exports. So this is very important. This region is extremely important. I'm glad.
Hundreds of thousands of jobs between trade in Quebec and New York.
The number between Canada and New York is 700,000, and so it's certainly important for Quebec. And I think we can tap on more. The U.S. is our number one partner. It is extremely important, and New York State is number one in the number one. So.
And the Northeast Corridor is obviously important.
The Northeast
as well.
Corridor and Plattsburgh is such a region with so many firms and Quebecers working here. And as Gary Douglas would say from the North Country Chamber, we're not trading partners, we're actually building things together. We are so intertwined. And so I think that we need to not only grow this, but not take it for granted. And whatever happens in Washington, it only brings us closer together to make sure that we continue to prosper on both sides of the border.
And it is so critical. In Clinton County, about 8,000 people work for Canadian companies. There's 180 Canadian companies with a presence in Clinton County.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And 8,000 people in a county this small go to work every day for a Canadian company.
Yeah, and actually the manufacturing sector here is booming. Of course, Buy America as some consequence of Canadian and Quebec firms having to set up shop in the U.S. to be able to bid on U.S. contracts, right. Which is not ideal for us, but we're going to make the best out of it. That's the decision we took. And these firms, I mean, whether they're Bombardier or Novabus, thrive, but also smaller firms in the ecosystem of those bigger ones. And we really want to focus on that as well. If Bombardier gets a contract in New York State, then we can bring into the mix a number of transport equipment companies that can complement the offer, for example, for transit authorities. So this is a model that works well, and I'm sure that we can do more, and specifically with this region here, the North Country.
And you mentioned Bombardier. Bombardier at the end of last year winning a huge contract with New Jersey Transit to build more than 100 multi-level rail cars for now, but number of options. They could build up to 1,000 rail cars, a deal that could be worth a total of $3.6 billion American when all is said and done.
Yes, we're very, very happy about that, very proud of that. And I met with Bombardier, head of the Americas, to discuss these very promising contracts.
You talked about quotas and tariffs at the Chamber breakfast, that many Canadians really aren't happy with the new deal to replace NAFTA.
Well, I would say that generally Canadian businesses in steel and aluminum are not happy, but overall the sentiment is that we're happy to have a deal, and it's a good deal. But there remains a problem, and the problem is the tariffs on steel and aluminum, the Section 232 of the agreement. I think people are hopeful this will be resolved. And the message is pretty clear that there will not be any ratification from our government while tariffs are still active, and there won't be any acceptability for quotas. So we continue to help our industry, our aluminum industry, make representation to make sure that the message is heard, and that we move forward, not forgetting about this very, very important topic that, in fact, has very negative consequence on the U.S. side as well in terms of jobs and revenue loss. So
the manufacturers are being hurt by the tariffs?
The manufacturers are being hurt, and including on this side of the border. So.
And in Ottawa, you don't think they'll ratify the new deal if those tariffs are still in place?
That's what the minister has said. Minister Freeland was just with Mr. Lighthizer, and she made that clear to him.
Any sign that the Trump administration and the U.S.
Unfortunately, if you had asked me that a couple weeks ago, I would have been more positive. But what we're hearing these days is not extremely positive. No.
The Trudeau government did make a concession when it comes to dairy markets in Quebec and Ontario.
Yeah.
Could that be a possible hang-up as well? I know a number of people are unhappy. They really want to protect those markets for Canadian farmers.
I think that's mostly between the provinces and the federal government at this point in terms of compensation for lost revenues as a consequence of the deal that came out of the negotiation.
Does the new premier in Quebec see opportunities to build on the success of the trade corridor, Montreal, Albany, New York City, and expand it?
Yes, absolutely. This is a region that and a state that he'll be visiting soon, I hope. But as I was saying, in the beginning, there's so much opportunities here to grow. I think one of the ways Premier Legault would like to do that is to put more Quebec firms with more U.S. firms more often. When these firms meet, they find a way to either be strategic partners or sell to each other, and it's the search for a win-win. So what we want to do is to activate more of the ecosystem of support there is for our companies in Quebec to be better able to export. We have an accelerator growth center where we take these companies. In this particular case, it's 25 million and more in terms of revenues, and we help them export their first million and a half, 2 million, and it makes us very proud, because if a company starts exporting, that may be the giant of tomorrow for our economy. So reforms are being made right now by Premier Legault and his economy minister. The budget tabled last week had an injection of funds specifically to help us export more and have more support in Quebec offices around the world. And so I think we're on the right track with an efficient plan.
Is there a particular industry you're looking at?
I would say there's many. Manufacturing is important, transport is important. Anything to do in and around energy, selling more energy, hydroelectricity. Consumer goods, we've done a good job with the fashion industry to bring them to New York City specifically. And not the least is innovation and artificial intelligence. So both the Canadian government and the Quebec government have recently invested massively in AI. The cluster and the ecosystem is very well organized. And in New York, our role will be to find a springboard to these companies that are at that specific stage to come and find partners in the U.S. and start selling in the U.S. Their solutions, because it is a revolution. And although it's not your typical brick and mortar, we know we have to be out there with our offer of AI. We have the best in the world in Montreal. And so the world is looking at Montreal, and we have to take advantage of this momentum.
And speaking of that, just this week, Corning Glass, which is a well-known company in New York State, to many, opened an R&D center in Montreal. And what's the focus of that going to be? And is Montreal becoming a new tech center?
Yes, exactly. I think this is what's happening. And when I helped, as you know, the transition government of Premier Legault and stayed on with his government at the start, I had the opportunity to go to Paris and Davos with him and the Minister of the Economy. Everybody was talking to us about Montreal as a innovation and AI, center.
And you talk about hydropower. At the breakfast last week, you talked about Quebec helping New York meet its goal of using renewable energy. Work is scheduled to begin either later this year or next year on the transmission line that's going to bring hydropower from Quebec down under Lake Champlain, under the Hudson River, about 1,000 megawatts of power to Queens, enough power for about 1 million homes. As that project moves forward, do you see others potentially supplying more and more hydropower to New York as it tries to reach that goal of 70% renewables by 2030?
Right. I would love to see that project going forward. I don't know that everything is ready for that project to go forward. This would be a very big step in transmitting more electricity to New York State, because as you know, there's a bottleneck right now. I think the key for New York State is really to help with the closure of Indian Point, included in the mix by 2021. I think is to be able to participate to the mix of energy that will allow the state to meet its ambitious goals. And so technically, it's not an easy solution, but our Hydro-Quebec is actively looking into this, and we're having discussions to see how we can help complement the solar and wind energy mix that New York already has in terms of clean energy. I mean, it's a clean source of energy, it's reliable, we have surplus in Quebec, it's better priced than any other forms of energy, and we can store it. So we truly, the message of Premier Legault is that we want to be the battery of the North.
Catherine Loubier, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Tom.
We appreciate
Pleasure.
it.